Thank you, Ariel Sinelnikoff. I'm excited that you decided to do this interview with us. And there's a lot of questions I want to ask you. I'm looking at your IMDb Pro, and it looks like writer, director, producer, right?
Yeah, definitely writer, director. Done a little bit of producing, but more on the writing, directing end.
Awesome. So yeah, there's a lot I want to go into. It'd be really cool to start with It Clings to Her, or even we can go a little bit behind that a little bit. And I'm just curious, how did you even discover ScreenCraft, and what was it that motivated you to submit your first screenplay?
Yeah, so funny enough, It Clings to Her is the second script I ever submitted to ScreenCraft. The first was my grad thesis, which was a short film called Catfight that my brilliant co-writer, Sarah Mahan, created, and we co-wrote it together, and I eventually directed it. When we were in the process of developing it in 2018, the year before I actually made it, we were looking for funding for it. It was a pretty big production, biggest production I've done so far. So we needed quite a bit of funds. Did some research and I found the ScreenCraft Film Fund. And so we submitted to that. I believe it was in the spring of 2018 first, and we got into the semifinals, and then we submitted for the fall as well, got into the semifinals for that. And then, kind of hadn't written a bunch until I wrote It Clings to Her in 2020. I think I did what a lot of writers did in the pandemic because we were home and I'd had this idea. So I finally wrote my first feature. And then I got to the point where I'm like, okay, it's done. What do I do with it now? And I remembered ScreenCraft. And so I thought, you know what, let's give it a shot. I think the first ScreenCraft competition I submitted to was the 2021 fellowship, which I got, I think, to the semifinals of. And I entered a few others, and eventually I ended up winning the horror competition with it. So
congratulations, by the way, congratulations.
But yeah, no, that's kind of my ScreenCraft journey. They've been so incredibly supportive, both with once I was a winner and a finalist, but in general throughout. With a few of the competitions, I did the reader feedback, and that really helped me develop it a lot more. Because, I'm sure as a writer yourself, like, it never, you think you're done, and it's like, nope, you're going to do another draft. And so
never-ending process.
Never, not until you go into production, really. And so, yeah, getting writer feedback, just getting that far, even in a competition, really kept the motivation up, especially during a pandemic when, you're not really doing much, you're not seeing many people. So that was really motivating and helpful.
Gotcha. Awesome. And then from It Clings to Her, I know you can't go into details, and I can cut this out. Like, we'll see how the interview goes. But if you don't mind, do you mind talking a little bit about kind of the next steps after you won, and then meeting with some of the people you met with on the development team? And then I know now you have representation, and like just kind of how ScreenCraft kind of helped you get that momentum. It would be awesome to hear that, from you.
Yeah. Yeah. So once I got into the finals of the horror competition, that was the first finals placement of any competition I got into. I ended up meeting with Danita, who was so amazing, and we talked for a bit. She kind of saw where I was with my career, with It Clings to Her. She gave some really wonderful advice. And then I think it was about a week or two later, I ended up meeting with Cameron, who really took to the script, and he really helped me start looking for help with actually getting it produced. And so we worked one-on-one, and then once I did win the competition, that's when we started talking about reps. So it was Cameron in particular who introduced me to my manager, Jeff Portnoy from Bellevue Productions, and it was just we met over Zoom and immediately hit it off. Like, I think we had an hour, 40-minute interview with one another, and basically the next day he ended up emailing me. My favorite director of all time is David Lynch, and I kind of went in a little intentionally not mentioning that in my interviews with managers, because I think there can kind of be a little bit of a stigma with his stuff. And I'm sure you can see I have some Twin Peaks wall art.
I love your background, by the way.
Thank you.
It's such a cool setup you have there.
It's our homage to film for the most part. But yeah, so the next morning he ended up emailing me saying, I forgot to mention, I loved your Twin Peaks poster. I'm a huge David Lynch fan. I was like, well, I think that tells me that we're perfect for one another. So yeah, I ended up getting repped with him, and it's been really wonderful. We've been developing a new project together while I'm working on It Clings. And then recently, this is the part I can't go too much in detail with, but I am in the middle of signing an attachment agreement with someone. So Yeah, that's been exciting. And hopefully my goal is to try and actually get it made in 2023 with myself attached as the director. So crossing my fingers for that. But
Yeah, well, we will be putting all of our positive vibes your way,
thank
and
you.
I'll be thinking about you. So curious. I'm kind of curious. I kind of want to just kind of go backwards a little bit and ask you. This is something I like to get. I just love to get everyone's perspective on it. But what was it that even got you in the very beginning? What was it that even got you into cinema, into film? What is it that made you want to make movies? You know?
Yeah, it's a little embarrassing. So I kind of figured out I want to be a filmmaker by the time I was about 15 or 16 years old. So pretty young. I was doing theater at the time, thought I was going to be a Broadway actor. And then I realized I am very mediocre at singing, dancing, and acting. So that was off the table.
Gotcha.
But at the time, I had started I kind of taught myself how to edit for a class project in my English class. And I discovered, I don't know if they still call them this today, but I discovered what at the time were called fan videos on YouTube, where you basically take like a movie or a TV show, you kind of edit a music video out of it.
Oh, yeah. I know.
And I became obsessed with those, just coming home after school, watching a bunch of like my favorite movies. And one day I just kind of had the audacity to go, I don't know about that cut. I feel like they could have timed that better. They could have used this clip from the movie with this lyric. And I thought, well, I just taught myself how to edit. Might as well give it a shot. And I did. And I ended up having a pretty popular YouTube channel for a while. I think it was my most popular video, almost had 1 million views at one point. And then they shut it down for copyright infringement.
Oh,
So
yeah, of course. Yeah.
they got me.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of how I really realized how much I love film and wanted to get into filmmaking. I was very fortunate to have incredibly supportive parents as well, who basically saw my talent before I did. And they were really kind of, especially my mom was kind of encouraging me to go towards film. And I ended up being really lucky in that my high school had both a film and a broadcasting program. So when I was a junior, I was able to take those classes, and that's basically what sealed the deal. I was like, I'm doing this forever.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's really cool. I love, this is exactly why I like to ask that question, because like obviously something that I've noticed and everyone that I talk to is you, even at a young age, even when you were still in high school, you took action to do something about this love that you had. Most people maybe would watch videos on YouTube and that would be the end of it. They would just love to watch videos, but you decided to take action, start a channel for yourself. Unfortunately, it got shut down, which is normal for YouTube. But like, that probably was that thing that kind of pushed you into thinking like, man, I know how to edit. Like people like this stuff. And so I love hearing those stories,
Yeah. It's so funny because for the longest time, I actually thought I was going to be an editor because I loved it so much. And I kind of realized at one point, editors are kind of the final writers of the film, which I loved. And then once I was in college, I realized I just don't have, I'm married to an editor. So I really, really respect the craft of it. I just don't have the patience for it, unfortunately. So yeah, I eventually switched over, realizing I love writing and directing way more. But it's funny how when you're young, you really kind of have those at least the seedlings of what you love and will love forever. And it's following those breadcrumbs, honestly.
Yeah, I love that. It's so motivating to hear that, like you just started getting this momentum starting from videos that you watch on YouTube. I love it. So what was like the first project, kind of bigger, maybe in college or whatever, but what was it a short film? Was it a screenplay that you wrote? What was like your first project that you really took on and decided I'm going to make my vision manifest,
Yeah. I would say, I'd done a bunch of shorts in high school and kind of earlier college. I definitely wouldn't show those to anyone because they're very, very amateur kind of stuff. But the first bigger production I did was my undergrad thesis. So I went to San Francisco State University, which has a phenomenal program still to this day. And what's interesting is not everyone in the cinema, they have a very large cinema program of, I think, like several hundred students. So not every senior can possibly do a thesis. So they pick 15 students every year. And I was lucky enough to be chosen my senior year. And at the time, I entered in 2013 to the first semester of thesis. And the 2012 elections had just happened. And I was very angry with what was being talked about, particularly when it came to women's bodily autonomy. And unfortunately, we're seeing this again. But at the time, abortion rights were coming up, as well as certain politicians were trying to claim that there is such a thing as legitimate rape and not legitimate rape, which just angered the hell out of me. So I was like, I need to make something about this. That's what I do when I'm angry or have a certain amount of feelings about something. I make a film about it. So I ended up writing this horror movie called Insane that was about a girl who lived in the woods with her dad. We kind of don't know what time period it is. And she tries to escape because he's kind of just kept her there. He prevents her from it. And then she starts having these nightmares of this hooded figure doing this ritual on her. And the next morning she wakes up somehow miraculously pregnant. And she doesn't know why or how. And so it's about her journey trying to find herself and trying to escape this prison that her father has created for her. So we made that. We ended up building an entire cabin set on my school's soundstage and levitating an actress over fire, which was absolutely crazy. So that was definitely the first biggest project I did. I wrote, directed, and edited that. And it was super fun. My boyfriend at the time, who was now my husband, shot it. My best friend did the sound. It was a really amazing group effort. I'm still friends with so many of the people that worked on that today. And so
was that a feature? Short?
No, it was a short film. It was, I think it's like 8 minutes long.
Watch it. That sounds like such a cool short. Is there a place I can watch it?
Yes, it's on my Vimeo. It is very old, so I get a little self-conscious about, my old directing stuff, but it is on Vimeo.
Cool. It's such a cool idea. That sounds so interesting. But and that leads me into kind of, this is another thing that I always like to get people's perspective on is you said you had this anger, you were seeing things happening. It pissed you off, and that kind of led you to want to make something about it. So like, where do you get ideas from, like just generally speaking? And then what is your first step? Because in the ScreenCraft community, like we have a lot of different people, but we have people who are just starting out. Like maybe they haven't even written their first screenplay and they're just starting. So for people like that, like, how do you develop an idea? Where do you get ideas? What is your process for starting to actually bring an idea to life?
Oh man, I don't know if I can narrow it down to exactly one way.
It's a loaded question.
Totally. I can tell you definitely how I came up with It Clings to Her. I think in general, I get very lucky in that I work in primarily genre films and specifically horror. And a lot of my ideas do come from either anger or fear or something that is really bothering me. And I need to kind of work it out in some way. And horror is just
by the way, I just love like that approach to it.
It's definitely cathartic, and I think that's why I love horror so much. Like I always give my mom credit because she's the one who introduced me to horror when I was 11 years old. She showed me Psycho for the first time, and it just traumatized me in the best way possible. And looking back, I especially through middle school was just obsessed with horror films. I rent them from the video store at least every weekend, and kind of in hindsight, I think I was kind of like using horror as catharsis of what my middle school brain was going through. And then eventually I ended up taking a couple horror classes in my grad and undergrad studies. And I realized through those, like, oh, this is actually cathartic. This is what the genre is kind of meant for. And so everything kind of started to click at that point of like, this is why I kind of write these types of films and whatnot. With It Clings to Her in particular, that also, it came out of both fear and anger as well, kind of like Insane. I first came up with the idea in about late 2018 when a couple of my loved ones were telling me that they were having paranormal experiences in my childhood home.
Wow.
And what was interesting about that, and full disclosure, I think ghosts exist. Like I've seen enough weird stuff and know enough people to be like, I think it's at least possible. And what was interesting to me about that is growing up in that house, I never really had explicit paranormal experiences. Whereas my loved ones who were saying, oh no, I'm literally seeing apparitions or this weird thing is happening with electronics that cannot be explained.
Wow.
And so I thought, wow, that's really interesting and scary. Wouldn't it be interesting if there was a story about a girl who cannot see some kind of paranormal entity that the rest of her family can see, and that is causing issues that she can't see it, but everyone else can.
Wow.
So I kind of let the idea settle in my head. This was also right after, maybe a year after Weinstein as well. And so I was very upset over that. I learned many loved ones I had, had Me Too stories. And so I really wanted, it started kind of evolving into also discussing topics like that, specifically trauma. And even doesn't, I do see it as somewhat of a metaphor for sexual assault, but I know I kind of left it vague enough for people to kind of put their own trauma in it and see how trauma in general affects a person, affects an entire generation of a family. And I was also kind of processing my own generational trauma as well. And so it kind of was morphing into a little more of an idea.
Yeah.
Funny enough, it wasn't at all related to any particular religion. I kind of figured it'll be an incubus as like the main bad guy, and it'll be a regular kind of Catholic exorcism we do. And eventually, once I kind of started sitting down with it in about 2019 and trying to outline it, my husband, who funny enough is not Jewish, I'm Jewish on my dad's side of the family, but my husband is not Jewish. He goes, hey, why don't you think about making the entity a Dybbuk, which for those who aren't familiar, Dybbuks are a very specific Jewish entity that is kind of a crossbreed between a demon and a ghost. So it comes from the spirit of a deceased person who has sinned in life, but it has the demonic power of possessing living humans. And it tries to find a host. And I called it clings to her because they literally cling onto you.
Gotcha.
And so at first I was like, I don't know about that. I kind of knew about Dybbuks a little bit. I knew about the Dybbuk box. But he's like, research it. Just research it. See if it fits. And I started researching. I'm like, oh, this is perfect. Like, this is a perfect encapsulation of trauma, basically, and how trauma gets passed down and clings to future generations. And so the story suddenly became a Jewish story, which was really wonderful because that's the side of my family. I never practiced growing up, but it was always the side of my family I was close to, because we used to go over for Hanukkah and Passover and things like that to my grandparents' house. And the year I first came up with It Clings, my Jewish grandmother had passed away, and I was very, very close to her. And so writing it, and my grandfather had been long past, but I still to this day miss him. And so getting to write this and kind of imbue my own culture into it really was cathartic, and also made me feel close to my relatives who had passed away. So yeah, I meant to make that way shorter, but that's kind of the genesis of It Clings to Her.
I absolutely love like delving into these things, because something like, it's just people, I think sometimes when you're first getting started, this idea of the amount of emotional stuff that you can put into your script. And even like you said, like, and I would love to just get your thoughts on this a little bit more, but even like thinking about it as a metaphor for something else. Like, you work in genre, but this isn't just a genre movie. It's something that delves into these much deeper themes. It's an allegory. It's a metaphor. And I think a lot of people, when they're first starting out, some of that stuff is just kind of a little bit out of reach, and they kind of just maybe stick to a little bit more broad of a thing. And then also, like, just hearing you talk now, you're obviously a really passionate person about this craft. And that's something else that I love to talk about, because I'm a firm believer that passion is something that you create. Passion is something that you can cultivate, and it takes passion to really develop something that is bigger than yourself. And by the way, this movie sounds freaking awesome. Like, it sounds so cool. But I would love to get your thoughts a little bit. Like, how do you think about metaphor in your movies? How do you think about the themes? Do you really dive into subtextual themes? Do you kind of leave it on the surface and let things happen organically? And you can just talk about that however long you want, but I would love to get your thoughts on how you think about that stuff.
Yeah, it's so funny because like in my previous work, it was really surface level, and I look back on that previous work and really cringe, like, oh, this is way too obvious. It's very preachy, which that was a big lesson I learned, especially when I was an undergrad, of people just don't like to be preached to. And I think that's why storytelling is so important, because if you can make your audience care about your characters and the story and whatever they're going through, the message is going to kind of land no matter what, because they're going to care so deeply about those characters. And so now I take a much more organic approach to it, of thinking about what is the story that not just I want to tell, but I need to tell. Like, it is in me somehow and it wants to come out. And I kind of go from there. And usually I have a lot of I have a lot of opinions I'm very passionate about. And so they just inevitably find their way into the story somehow.
Gotcha.
It's a pretty organic.
Do you write out, do you have like a way that you kind of keep track of your ideas and write out ideas and develop themes and stuff? Like, I would love your thought, and outlining. Would love to get your take on outlining, because this is something that I hear these two different opinions on. Some people are like, they never outline. And then some people are like, no, you have to outline. So I would love to hear your process.
I have so much respect for the people who don't need an outline. I tried it once in grad school. I have an unfinished feature I will probably never finish. I tried doing it without an outline. I ended up doing an independent study with a screenwriting professor who read it and was like, okay, we're gonna, I know you wrote a draft of this, but we're gonna go back to doing an outline. I was like, you're 100% correct. I need an outline for this.
I'm the same way. Like, I tried for so long without outlining, but I can't even imagine. It's such a valuable tool, you know?
I find it to be a roadmap. In life, I'm terrible with directions. I need Google Maps, like, for everything. And that's how I feel about outlines. I find that it's easier to allow my characters to come out and breathe if I at least have a roadmap of where they start out and where they're going to go to. And then that kind of gives me freedom somehow. But first, I normally start with notes. I'm addicted to my notes app on my phone. I have little folders of the different projects I'm working on, and I'll just like date it and write whatever random note I need. And then that way I have kind of this cache of ideas for when I'm trying to figure out something in an outline or whatever it is.
Gotcha.
And then originally I started just like an outline where I would be super detailed with, certain parts of it, not as detailed with others. With this new project I'm working on with my manager, we actually started with a beat sheet, which I never really done entirely. I kind of done versions of beat sheets, but this was like a very standard, like, we are just getting like the beats on the paper.
Gotcha. Like, save the cat type beat sheet?
I'm not super familiar with the Save the Cat beat sheet. I think so.
Inciting incident.
Yes.
Back to that type of thing. Gotcha.
Yeah. I had this wonderful screenwriting professor in undergrad named Julian Hochster, and he created what's called the W model. So it's kind of like the V model, if you're familiar with that, but instead of a V, it's a W, and the midpoint is at the kind of peak of the middle of the W.
Send that my way. I would love to look it up.
Absolutely. I have to use it for every single thing I write, honestly. So I kind of did a beat sheet in that model, and we went through about, I think, 4 or 5 drafts of beat sheets until we finally decided this is the story we want to tell. And now I just sent him like a 21-page outline the other day, which was more fleshed out. I got to really explore the characters, explore the different ways that it's a horror movie. So a bunch of people die, and I got to figure out, okay, this person's going to die in this way, and this person's going to die in that way. So that was really helpful, kind of getting to just focus on the core beats of the film and then go, okay, now I feel solid about the story itself. Let's flesh it out more. And then once that's done, going to go to the page.
Yeah. See, I love that. I love hearing that, because it sounds like, you just put a lot of effort before you even type your first page. You have all these ideas. You try to kind of conceptualize that. You make these beats, and then you go from that to an outline. And then when you feel confident, everything's there, you get to the page. It's like, I love hearing this, because I think a lot of people, I know when I first started out, like, I'm still learning I have so much to learn. Like, so I love doing these interviews, but when I very first started, like, you just think, oh, I'm just going to write the script. I have this idea, going to write the script. And then it's like, people wonder why you can't even finish it, but anyway, I love hearing all that. So I was kind of curious, horror. I love the horror genre. And it's kind of like the characters in horror horror, like especially when you're delving into themes, like some of the themes and stuff that you're delving into, I would love to get your take on character development. How do you think about your characters? Do you do backstory? Do you think of them as characters are metaphors in and of themselves for certain themes? Like, how do you approach developing your characters?
Yeah, oh man, that's kind of like another one of those questions where it's like case by case, but usually I do end up having a pretty big backstories for the most part. This is kind of where the directing side of me mashes with the writing side of me, because I will develop those backstories so I can talk to my actors eventually and say, okay, like this is where this character came from. And I found that when doing that with actors, they tend to find it really helpful, which is great. But yeah, they usually they just kind of naturally develop themselves in a weird way. I know that seems like such a cop out answer, but
I get it. Totally get
it. It was really interesting with It Clings to Her. I was writing, it's very much a sister story, because the main character, the whole point of it is she comes home after 10 years of having abandoned her family because she doesn't believe that this Dybbuk that they're saying is existing.
Wow.
And when she gets home, her little sister, who she's had tension with, she has to reconcile the fact that she is actually possessed by this Dybbuk. Wow. And so it's very much a sister story in a lot of ways. And it was helpful because I have a younger sister, and not to say like their relationship I think we have a much healthier relationship than they do. But pulling from that personal experience of what is it like, when we get into arguments, like there's a whole thing where they have a Jack and Jill bathroom, which if you're not familiar with, it's one of those bathrooms where there's 2 rooms on each side and they both have a door going into the bathroom. And that has become such a metaphor for where they are in their sister relationship. Like if they're fighting over the mirror to get ready, or if there's a scene when they're finally getting along and they're about to go to this party and they're actually sharing the mirror, and like, the older character Rachel's helping Marnie with her eyeliner. So it really came from personal things, but also giving it enough wiggle room to be like, this is not entirely based on one person. These are fictional characters. So having that balance of allowing them to be free while also basing them in things, you've gone through or people have gone through. I think that can be really helpful.
Gotcha. Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's like, to go back to the cliche thing that everyone says, like, write what you know. You have to really bring your personal stuff in there. But then it's great to hear you say like, but then you have to have freedom with it too. Like you can't just completely base it off of one person. But I love like this. It's so cool hearing you talk about this movie, because like when I go see this movie, when I see it in the future, I'm going to be like it was so cool hearing you talk about this stuff so early on and then seeing it manifested, it's so fun. And this is the script that you won the horror feature competition with, right? So, okay. So this is kind of a good segue. I would love to know, I mean, there's so much I could continue asking you questions about story and development and stuff, but I would kind of like to get your thoughts I would love to get tips from you on, so you won the feature competition and then you met with the development team, you started having meetings. Like, how do you approach networking? I know it's kind of one of those words, but how do you approach networking and meeting with people? And what is it that you try to communicate to people that you're meeting with? Like, and also I want to put a tab in it because I would really love to talk to you about pitching. Like, because I know you've probably been pitching and you've had to pitch, and I would love to get your thoughts, but just kind of what are your thoughts on networking? Like when you start to get some momentum in this industry, like what is it that you focus on the most,
Yeah, I'm very fortunate that I live in LA. So there's networking events all the time. I used to live in New York for a little bit, where also same kind of thing. It's so funny because I feel a lot of writers, like we tend to be very introverted and not want to go out to these networking events. Yeah. And I totally fall into that category. And I think it's one of those things where you kind of just have to accept the fact it's part of the industry. And if you want to do this for a living, you have to network. You have to not only network, but you have to get comfortable with, I don't want to say bragging about yourself, but talking about yourself, pitching yourself as a writer. And I know so many people hate this word, but kind of as a brand, especially if you're a writer director. And so the way I approach networking is I think if the pandemic has taught me anything is really be careful with my energy so that I don't get too exhausted. So I try to really kind of rest up around the time I know I have a networking event. So that way I'm not overwhelmed by anything. And then truly, I think the thing that will kind of get anyone, whether they're a writer, a director, a cinematographer, whatever, I think the thing that will get people the furthest in this industry is kindness, because in general, there's just so much unkindness in the world and there's so many egos in this industry. So if you're kind and you kind of keep your ego at the door, I think you're going to be fine. And be friendly. Just kind of talk to people. Like, obviously you're trying to pitch yourself, but like people know when you're just trying to get to know them because you want something from them. Make friends. Like, go in with the genuine, just wanting to make friends, being curious about what people are working on. People love to talk about themselves. And so if you ask like, hey, what are you working on, new person I just met? They're going to want to talk about it. And they're going to probably make friends with you because you've shown interest in them. So I think making sure you know your energy limits, you prepare for that. And then you're just kind and generous and just friendly with people. I think you're going to fare pretty well. And go to as many networking events as you can, honestly.
And like you mentioned it previously, the whole thinking of yourself as a brand, like I would love to get your thoughts on, do you think it's possible? I live in LA too, you live in LA. So like, of course we have more access here, but do you think people that live outside of LA can still achieve some success with like building a network and connections? And then what are your thoughts on social media? Like putting yourself out there on social?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's possible. I have, It Clings to Her gone to the Austin Film Festival last year, and I ended up going to it, first time ever, truly one of the best weeks of my life. And I met people from all over the country, even all over the world. And I know people from Tennessee or Texas or wherever, and they are getting success with their scripts. It is, from what I've heard, a lot harder though, if you don't live in a major film hub like LA or New York, just because you're kind of having to work twice as hard. Social media absolutely helps because you are, anyone from around the world can really see your work. But the one thing you do kind of miss out on is the in-person networking opportunities. And I think especially after, not that we're over the pandemic, but after being quarantined for so long, people don't necessarily, we're kind of getting that Zoom fatigue, I think. So meeting people, meeting people in person, I think you get that one-on-one connection a little bit better. And that does sometimes lead to more opportunities. But that's not to say that you can't do it if you don't live in LA. I do think it's possible. I would say, really figure out what your brand is, basically. I do really kind of struggle with that word, just because it makes artists seem just very like they can be easily consumed, which I have a lot of thoughts on, but it's unfortunately a reality of how the industry has become. We have to really know, and brand is just another word for knowing what you are interested in making work about. Yeah. So I think if you look at it that way, you kind of understand the stories you want to tell and how you want to tell those stories, it's a little more digestible. But yeah, I think that's the advice I would honestly give.
No, I love it. It's a good tip. It's a good way to think about it, and just being realistic about what the industry is. Like you can't kind of delude yourself into thinking it's the same as it was in the 90s with the indie film boom. But and then kind of a segue again is like when people are first starting out, do you think, what is your kind of just your opinion on how many scripts someone should have? Should you write in the same genre, or is it cool to branch out? Like I saw your website. Your website is awesome. You have a beautiful website, by the way. But like just those early stages of building a portfolio as a writer, what do you think is kind of a good approach? Like same genre or different genres, or a TV pilot and a feature? I'd just love to get some advice from you on that.
Yeah, I really encourage people to explore when they're first starting out. I was really lucky in that I got to be in school starting out. And so I think that does give a little more flexibility of trying and failing, and you kind of have the safety net of, you're not you don't have a budget of $1 million that you're kind of beholden to. So definitely if you're in like that position, whether you're in school or not, which I think is mostly the position people are in, explore. Definitely. I mean, I wrote when I was first writing everything from horror to drama. I think I dabbled a little bit in comedy, just many different things so that you can figure out what is the thing you are most drawn to. And then once you kind of figure that out, I would say stick with it for at least a little bit, because the industry does like to pigeonhole people, unfortunately. That's, again, one of those realities that just is not going to change, at least for a while. Yeah. And so, whether it's a specific genre, a specific format, a specific theme that you like to explore, really hone in on that and become an expert, I would say, at that. Study it. I remember in both undergrad and grad studies, everyone would try and skip the film studies classes. And yeah, everyone was just they wanted to just take the production classes, which I can't really blame them. Yeah. But I loved my film studies classes, especially like the film history classes. It's where I found some of my favorite directors and biggest inspirations, honestly. And it really gives you the history of film and what, how we've gotten from the early days of just shooting basically documentary to today. And when you know that, especially with like a genre like horror, with what you're working with, the rules, then how to break those rules, and you really master it. So I would say hone in on what you love, learn about it as much as possible, and then really try and master it, and then start pitching yourself. It's really interesting because I was told for a while, have at least 2 scripts, whether it's 2 features, 2 pilots, or a combination, before trying to get repped. And I technically had 2 scripts when I ended up getting repped, but one was a pilot that I'm still working on, and it's horror comedy and much more comedic than horror. And it was a first draft. So I kind of have to count that as a second script, but I really only had one that was solid, and It Clings to Her, and I still got repped. Gotcha. So I think there are always exceptions to the rules, but know what the rules are. So when you break them or try to break them, you kind of know what you're working with, and just have, you got to have the drive. That's like the biggest thing, having the drive and the passion.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, it's like, I think it says a lot about the success that you're having, that you loved studying film history. You love I mean, it's like, I very much like consider myself a cinephile. Like I love watching and thinking about movies. And I think, when you take that approach to, like you said, trying to understand what came before you, these people created this industry and the foundations that we have. And it's like, we should study. That's why I was kind of surprised. Like really people in film school, like skip the film history class, because that would probably be one of my favorite classes,
Oh, it's so funny. I remember in grad studies, I had truly the best teacher I've ever had. His name is Sammy Gonzalez. He taught both my film history classes. And I remember when my cohort was coming in, a lot of people, because you could kind of test out of certain classes if you took them in undergrad, and a bunch of people either tested out or tried to test out. And then he ended up becoming like everyone's favorite teacher, because the way he teaches film, like you can just tell he is just such a cinephile and so passionate about what he does that you can't help but also feel that way yourself. And so everyone, I remember second semester, was like rushing to take his second semester class and actually starting to come to those classes. And I'll tell you, it's so funny. I always say I have 2 favorite directors. One is David Lynch, which, especially being a horror filmmaker, even though he's not technically a horror filmmaker, but you can see horror themes, especially in Twin Peaks or Eraserhead. So that kind of makes sense. But my other favorite director, and it's only because I took my film studies classes, is Wong Kar-wai, who is known for making these super romantic films that are just beautiful. And I feel most people kind of will hear that and be like, oh, you're a horror filmmaker though. That's interesting. But then when I explain why I love his stuff and how it does fit into my style, people go, oh, actually that makes sense. And it's only because I studied, I really studied the directors I was drawn to and the types of films that I found that passion. So I always encourage people, whether you're in school or not, study films.
Gotcha. And then like, just while we're on the subject of film school, quick take.
Yeah.
Film school, necessary, not necessary? What are your thoughts? So many people, I get that question a lot, you know, like, should I go to film school? Do I need it? What is your quick take?
I think it really depends on the individual, honestly. I am someone who I love academic settings. Like I've always really thrived in academics. And so film school worked really, really well for me. I really had debated going to grad school or not. Because I mean, if we're talking about getting into the industry, just working in it, you don't like, no one's going to ask you for a degree. You can go in PA, you can work your way up to, you know, camera or lighting or even producing sometimes, writing. But I think if you want a place to experiment and not have to have, you know, kind of stakes with it, school is a really great place for that. You also have the opportunity to make connections within school. And I will tell you, I still collaborate with some of the people I met in undergrad. You know, I mean, I met biggest examples. I met my husband, who's an editor, and I love working with him. My best friend does sound, and I try and pull her on everything I make. So it's really about getting to experiment, getting to learn, obviously, and learning that history, learning who came before you and how you can kind of use that for your own work and getting to network. So I don't necessarily, you know, like I said, you don't need a degree to, you know, have on your resume. You certainly don't need a graduate, like unless you're trying to teach, you don't need a graduate degree. I ended up going back to grad school because, again, mainly for the opportunities and the networking. I had specifically, one of the reasons I went to the grad school I ended up going to was I had wanted to make Catfight for a while, which ended up being my grad thesis. My writing partner, Sarah, had come up with the idea. She said, hey, you know, I want you to direct this. It's an action thriller, so it was going to require a very big budget. And my school, fortunately, would give each thesis project $10,000 right out the gate. And so knowing that, I was like, oh, we can actually make this. We ended up raising quite a bit more beyond that. But it finally became possible. So that was like a big reason I went, was there was this very specific opportunity I know I would be able to have to make something I wanted to make for, at that point, at least a couple years. So it really just depends on the individual and kind of what they're going for. But for me, it worked really well, honestly.
Oh, it's good. I think that's the best advice. Just depends like your personality and even if you even live in America and all that. But I love it. I mean, sounds like you used it to your benefit and got as much out of it as you could, which I think is whatever you do, trying to get as much out of it as you can is like, you know, the thing to try to do. Okay, maybe some fun questions. What are like your 3 top movies that you think really influenced you and still influence you to this day?
I'm glad you said 3 because I have exactly 3. I'm going to preface this with saying 2 of them are like my cinematic favorites. The 3rd is the movie that got me into film through the fan videoing that I mentioned before, but is my nostalgic favorite. So the first 2, the 2 cinematic favorites are The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, which is to this day, I think, the one film that has ceased to not terrify. Like, it always terrifies me every single time I watch it, even though it's from, you know, the 80s, I believe. Yeah. Still freaks me out to this day. So The Shining's one. And then on the polar opposite in terms of genre is Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love, which will always just turn me into a puddle. By the end of that movie just breaks my heart. I just watched it for the first time in like a year the other day. And I'm like, this movie it still gets my soul every single time. Yeah. So those are my 2 cinematic favorites, both beautiful in their own ways. And then my nostalgic favorite is Titanic. I just became weirdly obsessed with that movie when I was a kid. I've seen it like over 100 times. I started making fan videos about it when I was in high school. So that I will always have to give credit to because it's the film that made me want to make films. So I love it. It's my comfort movie.
Those are like 3 amazing movies to have on a list, like showing your style and like where you're influenced from. It's amazing. And then, you know, maybe just to kind of round off the interview, I would love to just, or anything that you want to talk about, like any tips that you might have for people who are just starting out, or tips for people who maybe have a feature and they are kind of like in that position, like, what do I do next? What do I do with this thing? I would love to just get any like final thoughts you have, motivation.
Yeah, I would say a couple things, especially if you're a writer or director. I really encourage writers and directors to, if you're just a writer, direct. If you're just a director, write. If you're a director, I also encourage you to take an acting class, and actually writers too, because I think what that does is it allows you to understand what the people you're going to be working the closest with, how they work, the effort that they put into their craft, and understanding what you can do on your end to make their job easier. So I got very fortunate in starting out acting way before I was working in film. And so once I started directing even just short films in high school, I knew what it was like to be in front of that camera and how much courage it takes to be in front of a camera or just an audience in general. And then I was directing and writing. Directing has completely informed how I write, because I know exactly what I want to see on the screen. And I have worked with enough people in production to know how they're going to kind of read that and translate it themselves. So I think that really helps to direct if you're a writer and write if you direct. The other advice I would give is, and I feel like it's so cliche, but like, don't give up. Like, especially, with writing, it can get so lonely. And I am such a believer in the maxim of it's always darkest before the dawn. Usually it's going to be that point of like, I don't think this is getting anywhere. That's completely the place I was, like, right before things started to really pick up with It Clings to Her, of like, I spent a year writing this, like, in my home, being a complete hermit. I don't know if this is going to go anywhere. And then I got a call from the Austin Film Festival saying I made the semifinals. And then not even a half a year later, ScreenCraft is telling me you're a finalist. Oh, and now you're a winner, by the way. And my life went from almost nothing happening. I was working retail at the time, to I had to actually end up not continuing that job because so much was happening. I just didn't have time for it. And so, yeah, just keep going. And I think if you have the passion and you show that passion, people really are drawn to that, kind of like a light, and they will believe in you. And again, especially if you're a kind person who is really involving people in your project, like, I'm such a believer in, like I said before, leaving that ego at the door. It takes a village to make a film. So if you're really involving people, making them feel part of the team, people are really drawn to that, and they're gonna believe in your project. So keep going, be kind, be passionate, and yeah.
Love it. I love it. Thank you so much. I mean, it was so motivating to hear you talk about this stuff and hear your story, especially like that last part about like working a retail job and then boom, now you're like just going as fast as you can, like toward the stuff that you want. It's amazing hearing these stories. So I really, really appreciate you doing this interview.
It was so much my pleasure, Cole. Thank you for having me. I've been so excited about this since you've reached out.
Hope you have a great rest of the day.
You too. Have a good one.